Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome back to day two. We're excited to be on our second day of the Funder Retreat. If I can ask, if it's possible to turn on your cameras to say hello and greet each other. It'd be lovely to at least give a wave to everybody and look around and make sure that you're meeting new people, that you're using SwapCard to connect with people that you have not yet met and you want to learn more about their work. Or don't forget to take the opportunity that SwapCard has that ability and that function so that you can continue to be connected even after, certainly during our time together, as well as after the retreat. So with that, I want to welcome you to day two. We had a really wonderful dialogue yesterday. We discussed and how we arrived to this year's retreat, which was informed by the conversations and discussions that we held last year at our IFIP convening. They were also informed by the wonderful input of our planning committee, of two of our members who are here as well, Tanya Stoll and Rachel Carey. And we are now at a moment of thinking about how do we continue these conversations on day two. Yesterday, we had wonderful presentations and sharing from Galina Angarova of Cultural Survival and Jennifer Tauli-Corpus of Niatero, who shared with us about Indigenous rights and self-determination in these moments of climate crisis. We also heard from Mariana Lopez of the Pahuancafan and from Christine Osawa of the Samdana Institute on the impact and the response to COVID that Indigenous peoples have been mobilizing to really looking at revitalizing their traditional practices as one of the ways to respond to the impact of COVID. And today we enter two different conversations, but critically important as well. And we're excited that you're here with us to have those conversations. But before we go there, I wanted to take a moment to share what you all shared with us on Mural. So I'm going to share my screen. And we're just going to take a few minutes to look at everything that you all said that you have been doing. And if someone could, my team can let me know if you are seeing Mural. Yes, okay. Because now I'm going to look on my screen over here. Because all these notes, everything that you have put here on Mural, and I'll zoom in so you can read it. And if someone also could put on the chat the link to Mural so that they could also start seeing it. Everything that has happened since last year's convening. And I just want to take a couple of minutes to just kind of identify at least two, sorry about that, two or three highlights. One of them, which I want to highlight and start with, is that we have one new person or new funder that has entered into this space for the first time. So we welcome you. It's exciting to hear that there's someone that it's entering into Indigenous philanthropy. We definitely need more funders enter into this space. We also heard that you also mobilized to change your processes. You looked at reviewing your grant processes, you simplify your reporting requirements, also embark on learning and landscape scans. We have a few examples on how that took place, including some of the things that IFIP did over the last year in terms of sharing reports and other members commissioning reports. We heard from you about the work that you're doing to strengthen leadership, strengthening Indigenous leadership and network, the work to do with decolonizing wealth workshops, as well as tested new funding models. There was quite a bit of activity around testing and rolling out new funding models. So I invite you to take a look at what was shared by all of you. We have also other participants and members who also have recognized the important work that Indigenous lawyers play in the Indigenous movements and the importance of supporting Indigenous lawyers to advance the rights of Indigenous peoples, as well as the support that has been and much needed support that needs to go also to Indigenous women-led groups particularly, and how at least one funder started an Indigenous Women's Flow Fund program to support that. We heard, and we also read a lot of the work that has gone into supporting Indigenous-led organizations and Indigenous-led funds. And that certainly resonates with the work that IFIP has been doing. But it's great to see that there were a lot of stickies, a lot of comments on how that is actually being done by many of you in this work. And then I'll share just one more. Certainly the climate-related work that needs to happen. We heard yesterday from Galina and Jennifer the importance to continue to be engaged, particularly from the Indigenous movements perspective and advocacy work that they are doing there. That I think particularly with two IFIP members that share supporting the amplification of Indigenous narrative around climate and racial justice, and then funding Indigenous-led response to climate-related emergency. So I'm gonna let you continue to take a look at this board. I'm gonna now stop sharing so I can see you on screen. And this is just an example of how everyone that is part of the IFIP community, those that are members and those that are friends and those that are new and entering this space, is thinking about transforming how their institutions, their grant-making institutions are looking at this work. Now, before we go into the dialogues and I introduce the two speakers for today, we want to play back the recap from track A, from the conversations that happened this morning. So I'm going to ask one of my colleagues to please play that recap.
For us, but also for track B. So let's try to keep it to about 2 to. That is Janine, your group, who is presenting back.
I will be. We lost Susan through the discussion. She had to jump off for another call. So we had a small group discussion. There was only 4 of us. So we got to do a deep dive into some real experiences that we all have with seeing how white supremacy and internalized colonization shows up in our movement work, and the work, how difficult it is to navigate that in real situations. And so as part of that conversation, a couple of things came up that were very, despite us representing very different geographies and areas with different histories, there was a lot of consistencies in how white supremacy shows up in our own communities, right? First in upholding and validating that white supremacy characteristics are problematic and do very much get translated across our geographies through philanthropy and through sometimes even conservation movements in our areas and on our front lines, in that we have a lot of work to do to name and confront those things and protect our communities from those things. But we also have a lot of work to do to confront the ways that our movements, our peoples, our nations have also internalized these things. And we got to talk about a little of the conflicts that come up, for example, around the discussion of carbon markets and how we have Indigenous peoples on both sides of that issue. And then what does it look like to do our work when there's those types of conflicts, and really honing in on the mandate to really support and uphold the self-determination and inherent rights of Indigenous peoples, and letting go of the ways that we can even have like these characteristics of ideas of perfectionism when it comes to building liberation. And I shared a quote from Marx that was from this great reading, analyzing the leftist movement in the United States in particular, but I think also has a lot of relevance over what we're seeing and how these tensions are showing up in our movements across the globe. And it says like, one of it was like, our movements and the solutions we're building will bear the birthmark of the womb from which it emerges. And so being conscious of that, I think, helps us be a little bit more aware that we're going to make our own missteps. And what came up in the conversation is that particularly when we think of solutions, we can't think of a cookie cutter solution coming out of a developed nation and being transcribed to Latin America or the African experience, because they have different legacies, different histories of colonization, different political analyses, right, of what their solutions need. And so even in our movements, we have to have that room for that diversity. And we also have to have that comfort with the reality that we are going to fail in some ways, but what can help keep us on the right track is creating strong mechanisms of accountability for ourselves, for the partners that we're engaged with, for the networks that we're engaged with, and the funders we're engaged with, so that our accountability and responsibility to our communities continues to be upheld and continues to center those 4 R's of philanthropy.
Thank you so much, Janine. And I'm really happy that you were able to deep dive in such an important topic. And sometimes the small conversations are the best ones. So thanks for that. Thanks to everyone in the group. Let's head now to breakout group 4, Qualnisca's group. Who's presenting from Qualnisca's group?
Yes, we will. I think Elaine volunteered. So
Elaine.
We covered the questions one by one in an orderly way, but then there's a lot of overlap around what gaps and areas of improvements are needed. Meaningful representation is at the top of the list. Not the kind of tokenism that is pretty prevalent in organizations. Greater recognition and inclusion of women, not just access to resources, but the ability to use the resources. Governance within organizations should include strong diversity statements and definitely implement them. Also recognizing that there is increased creativity within the work of an institution that incorporates a wide difference of perspectives. The phrase "community within communities" comes up, where it is interesting and very meaningful when people recognize people with identity challenges or challenges to their identity, and can form allyships. On the second question, how can philanthropy collaborate and work to support more intersectional efforts? Naturally incorporate a great deal more diversity in staffing, not just the people, but their ideas. Be prepared to change and follow different ways of thinking in really forming the objectives of the organization. Things like the allyship was referenced as not a noun, but is an active action, and is probably the greatest outcome for building diversity within an organization. There's also mention of recognizing the need for anonymity, because inclusion doesn't mean people will come in necessarily fully ready to reveal their experience if they have come from an experience of trauma or have come from great vulnerability. Accessibility, recognizing the needs and accommodating the needs of people with disabilities, and also being aware that there are issues that will simply not be addressed by an organization unless someone representing that issue or the needs of a specific community are present, and it's kind of nothing about us without us. Or on the other hand, if our issue is not, if there is not a representative there, our issue is not included at all. And finally, the last one, how to organize and take concrete steps to bring more intersectional groups into the space, participation in the work, the actions, the movement building of other organizations focused on different work is important to for them to also incorporate your work and objectives in their work. Becoming familiar with communities in a non-charitable way, recognizing that what is shared in common. Also, participation is reciprocity. Recognizing how to welcome, how to invite participation, and not just be transactional. I think that's what I picked up.
Well, that was quite a lot that you picked up. Thank you to that group. I saw that notes doc. It was very representative of what Elaine was talking about and more. So thank you. And also a reminder that the notes docs will stay open and will be available. So yeah, that they will be there for people who weren't in the breakout groups. And last but not least, I would love to hear from Rachel's group. I think Antaya was there too, on decolonizing philanthropy.
Kim will be reporting back for us.
Thank you, Rachel and Anka and everyone that shared. There's definitely some themes that are coming forth, relationships and trust and all of those things. But in our particular group, The first question, what has been done and how do we move forward? This was probably the line that stood out for most people is more time listening and less time foundationing. Moving relationships beyond, moving our relationships into a less transactional space and more trust-based. Having applications and forms in different Indigenous languages, accessibility of the process, flexibility, really focusing on Indigenous women's agendas and priorities, engaging senior management in decolonizing, more funding to Indigenous-led organizations, sharing resources, and trust in Indigenous management and leadership and how they want to allocate their funds. So that was this question around what has been done and how do we move forward. In the second question, what does it mean to shift power? Look at different models of funding. Participatory grant making process. So having a voice in all levels in what is being funded and what the priorities are, sharing experiences across the entire organization, providing more general support. Transparency. We can't shift power without being transparent. Spend more time listening. Identify who has the power, and that isn't just in title, that goes beyond, whether it's staff or whether it's board, really knowing where the power is in an organization, decolonizing programs offered to the organization. So maybe working with an outside entity, an organization out of Canada was shared called a program called Kinship, and really being able to bring those kinds of learning opportunities to an organization at all levels of the organization. Ensure everyone is at the table, those who have the resources and those that are impacted by those decisions. The mechanisms, this is also, I think, something that was really impactful for everyone, is mechanisms for the community to hold the funders responsible and accountable. Make space for what partners want to tell you as opposed to what you want to hear from them, and ask them, what do you want to tell us and how do you want to tell us? It's kind of been talked about that these kinds of opportunities to create relationships, really meaningful relationships, are much more challenging in a virtual world, an online world. And how do you build that trust and create that kind of opportunity to really make those relationships meaningful? And then the last question is the tools. Create a centralized application and funding process. So maybe bringing 5 or 6 organizations together, having one application for all of those. Maybe they have similar kinds of funding priorities, and creating a prototype and seeing if that is something that could potentially work. Having an inventory of resources available for grant making, template or guide for open-ended reporting, capacity building for people at staff level within an organization, resources and tools on how to how to get money to organizations that maybe are more challenging to support. So those, and I know that's been talked about in a number of different areas over the last 2 days. Those organizations that maybe aren't fiscally sponsored or don't understand how to register in their home country, and maybe just don't have the resources to understand how to actually create an organization. Video reporting, reporting and funding depending on language, geographical location, technology, and share experiences in participatory grant making, what worked, what didn't work, how to make things better. And so there. Hopefully I represented everyone well, and thank you.
So that was a bit of the sharing that conversations that happened on track A, and in my morning today. And I wanted to now invite Anka to come in and to share, give us a little bit of this kind of the setting for today, but of the core questions. So Anka, I'll hand it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Lourdes. So here we are, track B. Welcome. We're in day 2. And today we are going to be looking at today. Where are we now? Where are we currently? What do we want and what do we need, right? Yesterday we looked at how did we get here? What happened in the last year? Today we're reflecting on today. And tomorrow on day 3, we'll be really reflecting on the future and starting to really drill down into what are our commitments to make this future work, right? So again, today we're going to be splitting out into 2 breakouts in track B. That is kind of a fusion of the 3 that we saw in track A. We're doing that simply because we want more conversation amongst you all. So you will see that in breakout 3, the focus is on the continued impact of racism and colonization on Indigenous peoples globally today. And we're also adding a component of decolonizing philanthropy, right? And you'll see that in your discussion questions if you participate in breakout 3. And for breakout 4, the focus is on effective and meaningful representation of intersectional groups within Indigenous communities. And again, we're also focusing on what can philanthropy do? How might decolonizing philanthropy have an effect on increasing the intersectionalities within these Indigenous communities and within these spaces. So that is what we're going to be doing for day 3. Just to quickly revise, I'll leave these here for you to quickly read through. These are the community agreements that we're going to go into the breakouts with. But before we go into the breakouts, I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to Lourdes so that she can present our community members who are going to tell us a little bit more about the 2 breakouts that we'll be talking about today.
Okay, thank you, Anka. And I just wanna, all right. So if I can invite Henrietta to join me on the spotlight, please. Henrietta Mary will be leading the conversation on how can we, what does the solidarity look like on addressing racism, the impact of colonization. And I just want to take a moment to introduce Henrietta. Henrietta is an elder of the Gimoy Walubara clan of the Jidinji people and traditional owner of the land in which the city of Cairns and southern suburbs are now located. Henrietta has wide experience in Indigenous cultural and natural resource management and impact assessment on intellectual and cultural property law, heritage legislation, and philanthropy. As an academic, she has published over 50 papers in books and journals. And in the 1980s and 1990s, Henrietta wrote extensively on issues related to Indigenous arts and the repatriation of cultural property from museums. As she served for 6 years with the UN Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity before becoming the program officer for Northern Queensland with the Christensen Fund. She was also a visiting fellow with the United Nations University. And in 2018, Henrietta was made a member of the Order of Australia in the General Division and was recognized as a Queensland Great. Henrietta has held various positions and she is an incredible Indigenous rights activist. And I welcome you, Henrietta, to take the floor. If you can just give me 1 second so I can bring up your slides.
Thank you. Thank you, Lourdes, and it's great to be here and supporting IFIP. I have worked with Lourdes with when I was with the Christensen Fund, so it's great to be back. Wow, racism, colonisation. I wanted to start this with a point of discussion to take away from the previous report, the funders report, which read, we need to not only look at the current surface thinking level, we need to look at the history and the fundamental meaning of it to ensure we do not reproduce and perpetuate the cycle of oppression, exploitation, racism and discrimination. Now let's go to slide 2. Slide 2, colonisation and its impact on Indigenous community. As we know, and we do know that colonisation is founded on the racist ideologies, which results in dispossession of land, suppression of cultures and languages, social and economic marginalisation, disruption of a way of life, subjections to alien laws, and a loss of voice in the political and government decision-making process. And we see this all the time. Colonisation started in the 17th, 18th and 19th century, and it's still with us today in the 21st century, and it's happening. And there's a good example of that with the Shaygots land being taken away, or the people being removed from the Shaygots archipelago in 1965, and the discussion that continues today on that. Let's address, which brings me to colonisation, from colonisation to addressing institutional racism. And I wanted to put this definition there. Institutional racism refers to the ways in which racist beliefs, attitudes or values have arisen within and or arisen within or are built into the operations and or policies of an institution in such a way that discriminates against, controls or oppresses directly or indirectly a certain group of people to limit their rights, causing and or contributing to inherited disadvantage. And we see that's happening all the time. We saw that happening here, particularly in the health area. And what I wanted to focus today is the areas on which institutional racism and how maybe philanthropy can really think about how we move forward. Sorry, I'm on track. Slide 3 and 4, Lourdes, there. I've just spoken about the institutional racism issue. I want to go into a matrix which we designed to combat and manage institutional racism in the health sector. So what we did was we identified a matrix for identifying, measuring and monitoring institutional racism. The premise for this is that what we can measure can be managed. And the purpose of doing that is two points: to encourage transparency and accountability, which had been discussed in the previous discussion breakout centres, and to look at accountability in the implementation of public policies relevant to institutions and organisations. 2 is to provide a framework for discussing between the institution and the people it provides services to on ways forward to eliminate institutional racism in response to a matrix audit. In applying this, how do we apply this matrix? We apply as a measuring tool. It's a measuring tool. It can be used both externally and internally. In terms of the methodology of it, it's based on a very simple measuring system. Each of the criteria are scored up to 10 out of 10, and the criteria selected for measurement are drawn from relevant government policies. And in this case, we only use public available information, and it's used in the measuring process, e.g. from annual reports, service agreements, strategic plans, It's a desktop exercise itself. And when we look at the way philanthropy gives and what happens in philanthropy, we can do this. We can measure it. We can find out from the annual reports what's been happening, how many people they've funded over the years in terms of the funding, how many of them have been Indigenous groups and organisations, and in what area and what field, and how have they been so effective, or have they been effective, and how one can then ask the question why if they're not, and what needs to be done further. It is limited when you do the matrix. It does not measure incidents in terms of individual racist behaviour. It's limited in that it doesn't measure casual racism, and however, in institution that shows high level of institutional racism, individual racism, race behaviour will flourish. So basically, if we address institutional racism, it will lessen the issue in terms of discrimination and racist behaviour that do happen within institutions. In terms of its adaptability, it can be used in other domains where institutional racism experienced by Indigenous communities, e.g. in the criminal justice, in the issue of disability, and education, public housing, etc. All the areas in which, again, what we look at in terms of addressing the issue of accountability and how do we move forward. In this, throughout this matrix, one would look at the methodology. It's based on very, sorry. Let's look at the slide 6. The indicators, we looked at the issue of slide 6. We looked at indicators and the criteria that goes with it. So some of the indicators that you see here, one's participation in organisation and the governance. The policy implementation was the second one. And if we can just go to the next slide, and I'll just go through the indicators: service delivery, recruitment and employment, and financial accountability. And if I go back to slide 6 again, in terms of participation, where's the legal disability? Where are Indigenous representation at the board level? Where's the representation at the executive management level? And when we look at philanthropy, we need to assess ourselves and say, well, so how many Indigenous people are on our board? How many of the executives are in executive management positions? And in terms of the policy implementation, and as we did with the health, we wanted to look at the closing of the gaps and so forth. What about the community engagement and public reporting? Back down to slide 7. Slide 7, in service delivery. When we deal with philanthropy, we do deal with how do we actually service these Indigenous communities with the funding. Collective funding is probably a better way to go in funding in philanthropy, so that it's philanthropists and government or a mixture of others and industry groups. Service delivery in terms of how you service your local community, cultural competence, and the reporting system can fit into that category. The recruitment, employment profile, these are the issues that need to be addressed. And the financial accountability and reporting, I think, is one that one has looked at in how and what they how do we move forward in this? Where is the money going? So, for example, just to give it a little bit more local experience, is that in funding, where does the funding go to? And, you know, how much of an impact is it making? Has it been really effective in addressing the areas in which the funds were actually granted for? And if not, how is that, what's exactly happening in that space? If we can go to the next slide, which I'll be finished in a few minutes, applying the matrix in philanthropy. And one of the examples of applying the matrix is to use it as a due diligence tool. It's a tool, and that can be used in any in really trying to assess an organisation in looking at its effectiveness and how it's operating. I guess access the suitability of non-Indigenous recipient organisations. You do that all the time. You generally find out about the people before you get the organisation before you give a grant to, and you go through that. But how much of that assessment deals with, oh, so if they're going to be doing a project that deals with Indigenous people, are they involved with Indigenous people? Have they been, do they have them employed in their organisation? What's their accountability to the Indigenous community with whom they've worked in the past, and has it been effective? What are the problems that arose from that? So all of these kind of accessing information on the non-Indigenous recipient organisation can again add value and address the issue of the kind of racism that is shield that you don't see. And this is so important. It can also be a self-assessment tool for a donor organisation. Assess yourself, see how you're going, have a look at how you've been accountable, have a look at how your organisation has operated over the past 10 years and 5 years and so forth. Has it been effective, and why hasn't it been effective? I guess one of the couple of the examples that I'd also like to give in terms of how do we apply the issue when we're dealing with racism and colonisation, knowing that land loss is a great loss to Indigenous people since colonisation happened on all the continents where they have, including Australia. How can one support environmental NGOs, non-Indigenous, with an approach that puts a certain condition of it? And this is back to, again, how philanthropy works. Do you need to look at some kind of condition when we're dealing with large NGOs, such as environmental groups, who goes out and purchases land and who goes out and manage those lands over the years? Because from an example in Australia is that governments will take land and put it out cheaply out there to buy, in which sometimes these environmental groups will want to buy, with one caveat that it becomes a conservation park. And but what it does is it tends to lock out the Indigenous people. So given that during colonisation, land was a huge loss, and here we have an opportunity in funding that when you do have environmental NGOs that are actually, you can go to the last slide there, Lourdes, when we have the Indigenous people actually wanting to purchase land, well, they can't, but to work very closely in full partnership with the environmental NGOs, or the if a large amount of money is sought from a philanthropist, then will they put some kind of caveat where it states that after X amount of years, the land that's been acquired through the funds of both government and the funders should be handed back to the traditional owner group. So then it allows the Indigenous owner group to build on that and move towards maybe building some kind of sustainability, cultural survival, and economic development in terms of the kind of investment that arises from that. And I guess to me, that would be the way that philanthropy would walk. And I want to end it there, but I hope that there'll be more discussions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henrietta. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you for your wisdom and for sharing how we can think about the matrix that you develop for the health sector in ways that we can kind of adapt it to reflect on how our own institutions are also measuring up to changing practices of racism, harmful practices that still have not moved away from a way of thinking that is not supportive of Indigenous leadership or Indigenous ways of thinking. I'd like to invite now to the spotlight, if my colleagues can copy that. I'd like to invite to the spotlight Dewey Ariani, who is the Regional Head of Programs for Asia for the Disability Rights Fund and Disability Rights Advocacy Fund. Dewey is a disability rights activist. She has worked over 18 years in Indonesia on disability rights and movement building. She has worked with grassroots and national organizations of persons with disabilities, or OPDs, to promote persons with disabilities rights and provide technical assistance to organizations of persons with disabilities and work with them to achieve their advocacy agenda through legislation reform and budgetary advocacy to build a bridge across movements. As a woman with a disability herself, Dewey has also advocated for the empowerment of women with disability and ensures that women with disabilities are heard in every decision-making process that affects women's life. With that, I'd like to invite Dewey to take the floor. Dewey will be talking to us on about the importance of representation and of intersectional groups.
Thank you, Lourdes, and thank you for inviting me in this really important discussions. I feel honored and humbled to be a part of this event and share our work as an organization that's supporting organization of persons with disability. So I would like to share my screen. So the Disability Rights Fund and its sister organization, the Disability Rights Advocacy Fund, support organization of persons with disability worldwide. And to build diverse movement, ensure inclusive development agenda, and achieve equal right and opportunity for all through advocacy for legislative change. Since launch in 2008, DRF and DRIF have operated under the principle, nothing about us without us, with people with disability making decisions at all levels of fund work, from governance to staffing and to our grantees. We at the DRF committed to promoting intersectional human rights and gender equality to our structure and our work. We're doing this through our grant makings, technical assistance to support organization of persons with disability to achieve their advocacy goals, and also supporting them, facilitate them in advocacy at local level, national, and international levels. We also supporting organization of persons with disability through building their movement to ensure that disability rights movement also diverse and inclusions and ensure that intersectionality within the disability is recognized in the movements. We also ensuring that the person with disability themselves is the one that driving the agenda of the movements. As I'm based in Indonesia and I work a lot in Indonesia, so I will share some of our practice also from Indonesia. But first, I would like to also mention the way we work at the global levels. So DRF and DRF make more grants to organizations of persons with disability than any other donors, resourcing the disability movement across 6 regions of the world to advocate for equal rights and full participation in the society. We support inclusive development that we leave no one behind, including the most marginalized group, such as indigenous people with disabilities. To date, the fund have moved around more than 40 million to organizations of persons with disability across 34 countries in the global south, including in Africa, Asia, Pacific, and the Caribbean. As pioneer global participatory grantmaker, DRF has led the way in the Shift the Power movement in philanthropy. So I would like to share our experience here in Indonesia, as Indonesia also one of the countries that have a larger number of indigenous community. So DRF and DRF in Indonesia, as in the case across all DRF and DRF target countries, our grant making in Indonesia support the implementation of our gender guidelines and prioritize the inclusion of especially marginalized groups such as indigenous women with disability and other with intersectional identity who experience multi-layer of discriminations. In Indonesia, we have awarded over 4 million across nearly 200 grants in 2010 With this funding, DRF and DRF grantees, many of which are inclusive of indigenous persons with disability, have secured key changes advancing equal rights, such as the ratification of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability in 2011, the enactment of the National Act on the Rights of Persons with Disability in 2016, development of the National Action Plan for Persons with Disability, passed around 8 government regulations to implement the National Disability Acts, adoption of local change, including local regulation at district or province levels to protect and fulfillment the right of persons with disabilities. And recently, we have one of our grantees, the Association of Women with Disability in Indonesia, have signed MOU with the Indonesia National Police to ensure inclusive and accessible services for gender-based violence survivors in the countries. And also we are supporting the other marginalized group within the disability movement, which is a person with psychosocial disability that have been able now through their advocacy to ensure that they have the right to vote during a local election. And this also ensuring those that living in the institution of person with psychosocial disability have the same right with others to vote during the elections. And the one that working on indigenous person with disability is one of our grantee, the Indonesia Association of Women with Disability, South Sulawesi Province branches. They have been working with AMAN, CSO, or largest network of indigenous people in Indonesia. And the collaborations, and then starting by doing research, collect data on number of persons with disability in the indigenous community in Maros district. And then from that, build or form a self-help group of indigenous persons with disability in Maros district. And then this self-help group have been AMAN and its YDI South Sulawesi working together to increase their capacity as the leader and lead the advocacy of the change in the district of Maros. And this then lead that indigenous women with disability then involved in participation and full participation in the decision-making process of village development programs, planning and budgeting process, and secure a budget from the government for the empowerment of indigenous person with disability in Maros district.
It's 10 hours.
What we at DRF and DRF have learned about grant making in support of effective and meaningfully representative of intersectional group within indigenous community at all levels of decision making is that first, listen to grassroots voice and supporting community lead dialogues. And this is what we do when we introduce the issue of indigenous people to the disability right movement in Indonesia. First, we facilitate a constructive dialogue between the two different movements and ensure that there is collaboration from the two movements and how they can work together and learn from each other. The disability right movement have been learned a lot from the indigenous movement and on the first phase where indigenous movement in South Sulawesi also learn more about disability issue and working together now to ensure that indigenous movement also be inclusive of persons with disability, particularly women with disability and youth with disabilities. Fostering collaboration and exchange across movement. This is something that we foster and encourage of our grantee to also working with other movements. Shifting power to participatory decision making, as it was the community who designed the program and what they would like to do after the research and after the data collection. And then it's YDI and AMAN give the self-help group to the community and they become more independent and can decide what they would like to do and how they would do the change in their community. Building partnership to increase capacity and advance rights. This is what we do in our grant making process. So that's what we'd like to share from us. Thank you so much and looking forward for our discussion.
Thank you, Dewey, for sharing the importance of, as we do our work in philanthropy, of the importance of thinking of the intersectionalities in our work, and the importance of including Indigenous voices from different communities, including within the disabilities communities. We earlier, this on track A, we heard this morning from Teresa Zapeta on the importance of including Indigenous women, as well as members of the LGBT community, as part of the work that we all need to do to ensure that we are really being inclusive of everyone. So thank you for sharing. Thank you, Henrietta, and thank you, Dewey. I think I'm gonna now, believe I'm gonna hand it over to Anka, who's gonna lead us through the next part before we go into a small break and go into breakouts.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you. And thank you to Dewey and Henrietta. It really got us in the headspace. I'm sure everyone is thinking of a lot of ideas that they want to bring into the breakouts. But before we do that, we are going to do today's interactive. So for those who weren't here yesterday, how are we kind of grappling with the core question? Well, we have the two breakouts, which will happen after our break in a few minutes. And we also have a daily interactive that we all respond to together using a tool called Mural, which I'll explain in a little bit. But today's interactive, we're going to focus on what do you want to see the IFIP global community bloom into? Right? So it's aspirational. It's thinking about getting to the future, right? To then tomorrow in day 3, really grapple with, okay, this is what we want to bloom into. Now, how are we going to do it, right? So today we're going to stay with the aspirational. And here is the mural for day 2. If someone from the IFIP team can put it in the Zoom link. And so let me give a brief overview of how to use Mural again. So first you get the link, which will be plopped into the Zoom. You click on the link and it will prompt you to either name yourself or enter as an anonymous animal. The animals are always very fun and diverse. So you are in the mural. And now what you're seeing essentially is a virtual whiteboard, right? With a lot of Post-it notes. These little yellow guys are Post-it notes as well as the green ones. And how you're going to navigate, and this is really the key, is if you have a trackpad or a mouse pad, you're just going to expand as if you were expanding on your cell phone, and then not expand, but the opposite of expand, going the opposite way with your fingers, right? So I'm going to put my cursor here over day 2, and I'm going to motion and zoom in right there. And then what we see when we enter the mural is day 2 and the question, what do you want to see the IFIP global community bloom into? And there's 2 other questions underneath it, which are a little bit more provocations for you all. And it's, what would you prioritize? I'm sure that everyone has, a wish list of what the IFIP community could be, but what is it that we really want to prioritize for the IFIP community? What are really those things that are top of mind? And also, already extending the challenge, how can we support the IFIP community and each other in achieving that, right? So what we're going to do now is everyone is going to answer the question at the same time. How you click on a Post-it is simply clicking with your mouse. It doesn't matter if you have a trackpad or a free-held mouse. You just click on it, and to click and drag, you can move it. We don't need to move it. It can stay in its place. And to write in it, we're just double-clicking in it, double-clicking in the Post-it and writing in here. So I'll let everyone start to get the juices flowing. Again, the question is, what do you want to see the IFIP global community bloom into? Thinking of what we want to prioritize and also how can we support each other in that, right? Any questions on mural? I'll be looking in the Zoom chat, but also feel free to ask the question. I'm sure others have it if you also have it. Okay. So we're seeing more collaboration and co-funding opportunities. Also, if you have more than one idea, we want to see all of the ideas, but please do put one idea per post-it. That way it's easy for us to cluster and group the ideas together, more easily spot trends. We also have regular convening and collaborating to share best practices. That's something we heard a lot from in track A as well. Solid IFIP network in Australia. To become a regional leader for better Indigenous-led philanthropy.
And Anka, I want to just also invite Dewey and Henrietta if they wanna say we can type it for you if you like, if you wanna add anything.
Please, yes. We can also type into the Zoom and we'll copy and paste right onto the stickies. Whatever works best. We have others here. Resources for new Indigenous philanthropists. That's an interesting one that didn't pop up in track A. Network support for Indigenous philanthropists. And if you feel so inspired, I'm sure that you all saw when I opened the mural, but down here are the responses of your colleagues. And some people are clustering for us. Thank you. And writing their ideas in your clusters. Yes, but this is what some of the ideas from track A are.
Lourdes, it's Tanya. Can you, all I can say is I'm so excited to see some of these things being written.
Oh, I'm glad to hear, and I appreciate that you are all trying this in interactive way of participating with technology.
All right. So I think we got the hang of it. What we'll do now is we will pause for a 15-minute break. Thank you, DJ Rachel. We very much appreciate the music, keeping our energies up. So welcome back, everyone. As you're trickling back, I hope the break was good and you feel replenished and ready to start in the breakout rooms. So let me share my screen again and share with you all the questions that are going to be guiding your 2 breakout rooms. So for breakout 3, which will be facilitated by Henrietta, we're focusing again on what does solidarity look like for us in addressing the continued impact of racism and colonization on Indigenous peoples globally today. The 3 guiding questions are, what does solidarity look like for us? How can we support each other in navigating these oppressions? And finally, what role do we want funders to play in this fight and in decolonizing philanthropy? So we snuck that in so that you guys can also grapple with the other theme of the other breakout session. For breakout 4, we have ensuring effective and meaningful representation of intersectional groups within Indigenous communities. This one is going to be facilitated by Shanda, IFIP's own. And the 3 questions are, what are the gaps and areas of improvements to enhance the representation and participation of intersectional groups? How can philanthropy collaborate and work to support more intersectional efforts? How to organize and take concrete steps? And then what roles should funder play in decolonizing philanthropy? One connected with this theme. So these are the questions. I'll leave them on this screen just for a few more seconds. And I'm going to, again, for those who have not been here, the breakouts last for 55 minutes. There's a welcome, there's then a brief silent exercise, and then there's a lot of discussion happening. And finally, we wrap it up with a closeout question. So in addition to these questions, oops, why can I not exit out? There we go. Each breakout room also has their own breakout Google Doc, where we will collaboratively, as we are doing in this participatory retreat, take notes together. So for example, for what does solidarity look like for us, we come in and the facilitator will go over the community agreements with everyone. We'll select who wants to be our group presenter. And again, a reminder, we want to keep it to about 3 minutes as a present back. So we select a person who's going to present back, and then we'll start looking at the discussion questions. And here is where the facilitator will prompt the question. And first it'll be a little bit of silent writing and silent reflection. So everyone really has a chance to participate and really get into the question before starting the discussion. And then after that minute of silent writing, then we're really prompting the discussion. And again, the facilitator will go down to the second question, same thing, 1 minute of silent writing before prompting a group discussion. And again, for question 3. And then we end with a closeout question, and that is the 55 minutes. So let me stop sharing my screen. So thank you, Track B. I'm really excited to hear what you have for us in both breakout sessions. As a reminder, just about 3 minutes, if we could present at about 3 minutes, that would be great. And why don't we hear from breakout room 3, Henrietta's group, who's going to be sharing with us today.
Can I have an extra 1 minute to prepare? Is that okay? Because I'm just reading the notes again. Is that all right? Can we start with a different group?
Sure. With the other group, Chanda's group, how are you feeling? Are you feeling prepared?
Yeah, Rachel and Dewey, are you both are ready, right? Thank you so much for volunteering too. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
So,
Rachel, you want to start? Mhm.
yeah, I'm going to take the first question, and Dewey's going to take the second and third. So the first question we addressed were, what are the gaps and the areas of improvements to enhance the representation and participation of intersectional groups? And some of the comments we discussed and heard were, you know, this usual suspects, these recognized leaders, the loudest voices in the community always are the first to represent the communities, but are not always representative of everyone in the community. And it's a challenge accessing intersectional groups. And there's a deep need to be intentional and purposeful when seeking out the voices and representations of those within groups that don't typically get their voices heard. We talked about recognizing that there are identities within identities and that these typically create greater vulnerability. The lack of understanding of how intersectionality can exacerbate difficulties in participation, and specifically for Australia, there was a discussion about transport disadvantage and also digital literacy, but then there was a discussion around general accessibility and the need for better accessibility to intersectional groups. Enabling environments across all groups, and typically what happens is that lack of trust that in these groups and their ability to carry out activities. Example, youth and women's group and women's groups. I'll read one more here. And within these groups, it's important to understand a community's own cultural traditions, and don't assume that existing structures are appropriate for these groups that sort of are living on the margins. Do we?
Thank you, Rachel. Now I will present the second question and third question. It was rich discussion. I'm not sure I can able to summarize in 3 minutes, but I will try. So the second question is, how can philanthropy collaborate and work to support more intersectional effort? How to organize and take concrete steps, bring more intersectional group into the space? In the discussion, we discussed that it will be important to effectively seek out people who represent diversity within community. Consider funding people time to come together and learn from each other. Consider the power dynamic within community and society to address them. Understand the preferred medium and common tools for intersectional group and learn to use them well. Must make sure that funding process criteria are appropriate and accessible to the group it's trying to reach out, particularly when we're talking about intersectionality, that most of the group may be really emergent groups that they might be not yet have like legal standard or register, but we as funders take also the risk to give the opportunity to apply for our fundings, but also ensuring the enabling informants in the process, in the application process. For example, ensuring that we respect also their own language, so they can submit their applicant in their own language. Understanding stigma and how to support communities to address it. And we should also remind that the community in themselves is the one that understand the context and have the expertise to really analyze the situation, the context where they are, and develop their works from that. So we need to also recognize that expertise that they have, value the leadership of the community, have a lens in process to check reference for intersectionality, ensure it's part of what we are funding. And the third question is, what role should funder play in decolonizing philanthropy? Apologize for noisy backgrounds. There's a construction near my house. Consider what genuine representative within the institution, not just related to grant process, but throughout the whole organizations. Give autonomy with funding, recognize again expertise in the community and value the culture. This is seen as an asset and value that, and not see as a risk. Process and practice led by indigenous people allow for influence and input, allow communities to define success, and have to weigh accountability, allow communities to measure how appropriate and meaningful your relationship are, make their platform available to give community a voice about what works well and how funder and communities can work together to address the barriers, the challenges they have. And funding indigenous people, not a risk, but it's a smart investment. We should consider that, and rhetoric, but not acting a funder with the right rhetorics, just changes as one who does nothing. Community partner holding funder accountability. I think it's very important to also see how the community also see our how accountabilities we ask, and
maybe just one more point, do we?
Okay.
One more point.
Okay. Sorry, deconstructing institutionalization and discriminations, giving funding to, when donor or funding of philanthropy, giving funding to women, why not also funding indigenous women with disability or indigenous women? So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to both of you. I know that that group had a lot to discuss. Sorry for cutting you off, but thank you for taking those diligent notes so we can also see all of the rich conversation that you all had. And now I want to turn it over to the other group. Niall, are you ready to present?
Thank you. Sorry about that. I came in a little late and I wanted to do the rich discussion that I missed just. So the first question was, what does solidarity look like? And looking through the notes, breaking it down to understanding and assumption. So solidarity is taking the time to understand what really is happening as a result of colonization, and the acknowledgement that it's not just something that has happened in the far past, but is something that has happened in the near past and has continued to happen now. And those impacts are deeply felt on an ongoing basis as well. And that's not only just looking from a non-Western to an Indigenous space, but within the impact of within Indigenous communities as well, and how Indigenous peoples impact on ways of relating to one another is the way that it's been written here as well. I think the other one is the philanthropy playing its role in understanding that it can be as an opportunity to create space for philanthropy to listen as well, and to be challenged, and that's okay, and that's a growth and a way forward as well. So solidarity is creating those spaces and finding the ways to give up power and suspend, kind of preconceived notions or thinking, and just sitting in space and listening, deeply listening, not just hearing, but like deeply understanding as well. So the second one is, how can we support each other in navigating these oppressions? And there's this concept that, it's moving from, I guess, summarizing, moving from the performative to the substantive in some way, shape or form. So that is, sometimes not focusing on the big romantic, grand gestures, but actually focusing on the practical and impactful decisions and things that can be done. And that moves from, kind of making sure that Indigenous peoples are well and have the opportunity to heal and support one another. So if that's supporting basic needs around medical education, social services and wellness, then that's a role that philanthropy can play in supporting First Nations people, Indigenous peoples. It also talking about, that again, the decolonizing thinking is that interrogation of whiteness and Western frameworks as well, and the impact that those frameworks have, and that it's not just enough to promote, but also there's a risk that by just creating spaces within a Western or colonial framework, that those same type of mistakes are going to be perpetuated when you create spaces. So just being really aware of interrogating what those colonial systems are, what their deep impact is on an ongoing basis as well. And the final one was and I was involved in this one as a robust conversation in particular, which was around what role do we want funders to play in fighting and decolonizing philanthropy. And there was a really rich conversation around, Indigenous-led funds, whether that's a good thing, not necessarily a bad thing, but what does that look like? Is that, again, perpetuating within structures, colonial structures, but, as a way of shifting thinking and funds into First Nations communities, is really practical and logical as a first and next step as well. And I think, again, Tanya mentioning this idea of foundations getting out of their own head a little bit as well, and out of their own foundations, and that inward focus as well, and starting to look at that external focus as well, and looking at shifting sector-wide practices and mindsets and frameworks as well. So kind of not only interrogating your own behaviours, and that's wonderful, but doing the more substantive work of doing the work to shift and change the sector as well. So, and then there was just, the recognition as well between the link between race, capitalism and colonialism, and, it could probably be a conference in itself as well, but those systems that have enabled, I guess, such wealth in a private philanthropic perspective to be generated, that has given the rise to private philanthropy, and fundamentally how that's not necessarily in a good system in itself. So, by almost what philanthropy's role is, potentially kind of breaking philanthropy so it's not needed in its form, because in its current form, this is what happens as well. So I apologize to the group if I missed anything that was really important, because it sounded like such a richer conversation earlier as well.
No, thank you so much. That definitely sounds like a great summary, especially for someone who wasn't part of the whole thing. That means that group took excellent notes. So thank you to the group, and I'm really thankful that you all had that time to sit and truly discuss these like very complex and not easy to answer questions. So thank you. And with that, we're going to start closing this track for the day. And I will pass it on to, I believe, Whitney.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for being here today. Just before we close, we're going to go into a healing session just like we did yesterday. And we have our colleagues from ICA, Pearl and Melina, who came back and shared with us how healing justice looks like in an organization and what we can do to support it. And so we're going to play the recording from track A. And so please stay on and engage our healing circle. And for the next session, I'd like to invite back Pearl and Melina from yesterday, from ICA, who led us into our healing session yesterday. And they're going to be doing the same for the healing session today. And so Pal and Malina, please, you're welcome to take over.
Tansegwakia, Nia Melina Miawapan Labokam Masmo Nia Nihiao Kineskuntanawao. It's been so nice to hear what's been coming back for the feedback of the discussions that you all have had today. They sound very fruitful and meaningful and very deep. So I'm really happy that I got to listen in on that. Today we are doing the Healing Justice circle again, and so we have some stuff to present to kind of round out this discussion as well. But I will introduce myself first, and then we'll go into more of a discussion and show some PowerPoints and stuff as well. So I'm one of the co-founders of Indigenous Climate Action. I am the director of Healing Justice at ICA, and really happy to be talking to you all today about this work, because I think it's incredibly important as we push for healing justice spaces within our movement spaces, that we also are talking to philanthropy about these very needed places and spaces to support frontline Indigenous land defenders in our work. And I will let Pearl introduce herself really quickly too, and then we'll talk about what brought us to this work quickly.
Sure. Good afternoon, relatives. Hello again from Mexico. I'm going to hope that my Wi-Fi stays strong for the presentation, but if I disappear, I'll come back. It's just comes and goes, but should be good. Yes, my name is Pearl Gottschalk, and I currently work as Healing Justice staff for Indigenous Climate Action, and I also work as the program advisor with the Kindle project on the Indigenous Women's Flow Fund. So I'll just pass it back to Melina to tell a little bit about how she came to be in this work.
So like most Indigenous peoples, we inherit this work. I myself, the first time I was on a blockade was at the age of 7. I come from a frontline Indigenous community, a reserve called Little Buffalo, where I was born. And my family and community was fighting against the government and corporations, logging, oil and gas corporations. I was born in the heart of the tar sands, so my community was blocking a road, an all-weather road that was bringing heavy industry into our territory for the first time in the 80s. And so I've inherited this work, and have since, as a teenager, worked on social justice, Indigenous rights, land sovereignty, doing frontline organizing in the climate justice and environmental justice movement. So the past 20 years has been a complete sprint. I'm now 40, so it's been 20 years of sprinting, and I think which probably resonates with most people on this call. And then I got to a place where I actually completely collapsed. I was bedridden. I couldn't even lift a cup of tea. My system just stopped because I just kept going. And I think this is what a lot of us are taught to do, that we become these hyper-productive people, and that we're very valued by that in society, and which is actually a white supremacist value, which we don't a lot of times don't realize. And so I just kept going and pushing my body past its capacity and healthy boundaries. And so kind of experiencing this complete collapse where I was hospitalized a number of times. I had to go through a lot of testing and still am recovering from this. My realization was kind of like, wow, this is what I've been taught in this work, in this movement, to be able to, we are in crises. So of course there's always, we always need more people. We always need to do this work in a way that a lot of times we are under-resourced, underpaid. And so there's a few of us. And so, fighting against the tar sands, that's definitely how it felt for, a decade plus. And so this is actually why I started the Healing Justice program at Indigenous Climate Action, because I wanted to not perpetuate what we learned outside of ICA in those destructive ways of being, always sacrificing the expense of a person's well-being, oftentimes our families and our communities. And so bringing in trauma-informed ways of being into ICA, and then also into the larger movement spaces. So that's what we'll be talking a little bit more about too today. Hi, I'll pass it back to Pearl.
Thank you, Melina. Yeah, we kind of joke that we're actually now the elders, kind of really burnt out elders, who we want to then advise to the youth of a next generation to not end up kind of like we ended up. And we want to reverse the culture now so that changes for our next inspiring and amazing Indigenous youth to be sustainable through the movement. So yeah, for me, earlier in my life, I worked as a funder as well for 7 years in various organizations. And during that time, there was no institutionalized understanding within our organizations of the importance of healing justice for us as donors or for our grantees. So in 2015, after a devastating experience happened at work, I became unable to work for 4 or 5 years and slowly watched my life unravel. And losing my ability to work at the front lines and as a funder was the single most devastating experience of my life. But during this time, I was lucky to have some financial support and the care of my elders and friends and ceremonial life. And that caused me to start having real and vulnerable conversations with sisters like Melina and Ariel and Crystal Lehman, who I want to name here, because I began to really realize how deeply unjust our systems of care really were, and how the systems of care that do exist are often insufficient and not rooted in traditional culture that's meaningful, or were extremely under-resourced. And often there were systems that we had to fight to gain access to in times when we had no fight left in us anymore. And I decided that when I was well enough, I would speak up for healing justice, especially in philanthropic spaces, because that's the space that I know. And so that's why it's really deeply meaningful to be here with you today, and to really thank you, IFIP, for honoring and beginning this dialogue. So we're going to just launch into a little bit today in our session. We're going to tell you a little bit about the history of healing justice, what ICA is doing, and we're indigenizing it. It's really juicy and awesome. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what philanthropists can do. And then we're going to close out with a nice session with Melina. So we're going to share some slides and do a little bit of talking together. So healing justice itself is both a term and a movement. It was first coined by the Atlanta-based Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective in 2007, and they aim to address widespread generational trauma from systemic violence and oppression by reviving ancestral healing practices and building more new inclusive ones. And healing justice was taken up in a big way by the Black Lives Matter movement and by many key leaders in that movement. And Black Lives Matter has created many great resources, you can Google them, and began bringing healing directly into frontline actions and institutionalizing it within their organizations and encouraging others to do so. So it's become a bit of a movement over the last 5 years. When I started asking around, there was really no one knew what I was talking about. It didn't have a name. So at least now it has some kind of a name, which is good. So while we realize that there's many important Indigenous healing practices already happening around the world that already exist, healing justice itself kind of recognizes the need to bring this into our movement spaces as a whole and put trauma-informed tools into practice in our daily lives and work so we can be the most effective we can be. And it came to be in Canada and with Indigenous climate action, largely by the awareness and the work of Melina and Ariel, who are courageously using their experiences to start the dialogue about healing justice. So I'll let Melina talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, great. We're going to pull up a slide here, and Anka has so graciously offered to show this slide just to kind of drive these points home a little bit more. The idea that we are not actually sacrifices. I've had many people say, you are such a warrior, you're so strong, you're so resilient, and I was constantly sacrificing my well-being for the movement. And I feel like, that is a very noble thing to do, but it's also a very naive thing to do in the long run, because you become bedridden, you're no longer good to anybody else. So the importance of sacrificing our well-being is actually, we need to flip that script, and we need to understand that we are actually the altar, that we are actually, we deserve to be taken care of. We deserve to honor our well-being. We deserve to allow our body and our lives to be sacred places and spaces to continue this liberation, because our liberation is bound together. So ICA long-term has been looking at how can we create long-term well-being and longevity in our staff and in our movement in general. And so how do we protect and care for one another, and also the younger ones that are coming up. I'll just ask for the next slide to be. So this comes from Indigenous values, as Pearl was mentioning. We want to honor our Black brothers and sisters who have brought this important term of healing justice into our movement spaces. And how do we indigenize it? Because like Janine said earlier today, one size does not fit all. We need to ensure that we are indigenizing our practices, because, we all have different impacts of colonialism and genocide. We all experience it, but we do experience it in different ways. And so how do we indigenize it? And so for me, my understanding of it, my bedridden lesson when I was laying there, just completely unable to do anything, in extreme pain, was I have taken myself out of the sacred hoop. I have taken myself out of the medicine wheel. I have not included myself. I have just given everything external and left myself almost, I lost 25 pounds. I was a skeleton skeleton. I left myself as a skeleton. And I realized we need to put ourselves back in the sacred hoop, that we deserve to be a part of the sacred hoop, and that our ancestors and our elders would, would be like, in a way mortified because we haven't been able to create or continue to ensure that we are indigenizing healing. How do we indigenize healing justice? How do we indigenize and decolonize our spaces? And healing justice is a process of decolonization. So we need to move from the view of self-care, that this, I was very, I didn't want self-care to be, I thought, oh, that's a selfish thing. It's not a part of our movement, but it's actually, we can indigenize self-care and we can take back it and put it back into a collective movement. So if you go to the next slide, you can see how, we are all these individual spokes in a collective wheel, and that we all need to be taken care of, because if these wheels and these spokes aren't strong, then the wheel breaks. And so that's why it's so important that we ensure that it's not just about individual self-care and, this kind of like idea in Western society of like self-care is this individual thing that you can only access through if you have enough money, if you can go to a yoga retreat, if you can do all these things. I'm so sorry that I'm speaking quickly. My apologies. That is something that I have done with my autonomic nervous system, speaking too fast to try to get the points across quickly in the limited times that we're often given to talk about these things. So thank you for letting me know that. So it is so important as individuals that we have this care circle, and that we are a part of the collective, and that we ensure that we are taking care of the individual spokes, because to recognize that the collective will break if we're not taking care of all of these things on this wheel. So if you go to the next slide. Oh no, it's not showing the tiger. I'm not sure what happened there, Pearl, but oh, there he came. So the autonomic nervous system. So this is, what's coming out of neuroscience that is kind of catching up to what's been happening in our movement spaces, of how we've been all running on, there's two states that we live in, and there's the sympathetic state and the parasympathetic nervous system state. The sympathetic state, basically there's increased blood flow, like from when we are in a fight and flight mode. So right here with this tiger, we are in a fight and flight mode. So this is how we are oftentimes in our movement spaces, just running in a fight and flight mode, where when we stay in this state, our blood flows decrease from our brain, and it actually reduces our cognitive functioning. And that actually increases chemical stresses in our systems go up. And so over time, if we stay in this state, the chemicals are actually punching holes in our nervous system. And that, and that's why long-term, many of the people in our movement spaces have disease, have chronic disease, myself included, as well as pretty much most people I know at this age, because we have stayed in a fight and flight biological mode. And so what we need to do is figure out how, not only with our ceremony, which sometimes we can access and sometimes we can't access collectively, but how are we dealing and allowing our bodies to go back into a parasympathetic nervous system state, where we are actually in a rest and digest state. And so this is where we're bringing in tools into the movement, and trauma-informed tools to pair with our ceremony to bring in healing justice. And I'm going to pass it back to Pearl.
Great, thank you so much. So we just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about how philanthropy can support healing justice, because I really like it when I go to a conference and someone just tells me, okay, here's some really clear practical takeaways that you can start doing tomorrow. And maybe some of these will resonate for you and maybe some of them won't. So we'll just kind of do our best. I'm looking at the sea of faces in front of me, and I know so many of you from 10 years in this work. And I know what you guys are doing on the front lines, and how hard you work, and how diligently and how much you care for this work. And if you were like me, there was nothing I loved more than my work and my job. And we are committed to this for the long term. So let's see how we can start to change some of the systems. Next slide, please. So the place to start is always to start within, and recognizing the important role that philanthropy plays in building collective care systems, kind of shifting the idea from self-care to collective care, starting within anywhere we work, starting today, trying to change the dialogue from, why don't you just go away and take care of yourself, have a bath, take a week off, and come back when you're not burnt out. It's not what we need. It's not the conversation we need. So how do we radically transform our systems of our work, our care, and our giving? Next slide. And it really means having creative and courageous conversations and starting this dialogue with words we might not even have. Even Melina and I sometimes were like, we don't even have the vocabulary for this. And really breaking the traditional chains of professionalism and what we do and don't talk about at work, and creating a new language for ourselves in which you can talk not only with each other, but with your grantees, your partners. So this could look like inviting healing justice leaders into your spaces to inform and educate about where you can start to support this issue, and just allowing healing justice to be a central part of philanthropic conversations, or asking, how come it's not? How come we need more tools on this? So that's why IFIP's very forward thinking and having this here today. And so really for our organization, Indigenous Climate Action, investing in our healing justice pathway is the way that helps elevate the dialogue amongst our staff, but also our wider Indigenous community, that self-care and collective care cannot be separated. And when we strengthen one, we strengthen the whole, like the spokes on the wheel. When one breaks off, the other breaks off. So I kind of just was collecting beautiful images because my mind thinks in images of like, this to me is what is rampant in the nonprofit NGO culture, which is just overworking and being underpaid and burnt out. And studies have shown that 95% of all peace activists actually leave the movement due to burnout within 6 years. We need to actually stop over-romanticizing exhaustion and start owning the ways in which philanthropy has perpetuated this system and what it can do about it. Next slide, please. So really the most important thing I think is supporting the infrastructure of the culture of care for your grantees, for your organization. And that starts with asking radical questions, which can lead to radical change. And actually, when you ask questions of your grantees, be committed to resourcing the answer, even if it's not something that's technically something you would have thought of before. So funders can ask, I love this question, can ask potential grantees if they're thinking about funding or long-term ones, what plans does your organization have in place to ensure the health and well-being and long-term sustainability of your staff and your movements? And if you had resources for that, what would you do? And then actually fund the answers, even if they're new and risky. Next slide, please. So be in it for the long haul. Really, we got to, and this is I'll have Melina just put a blog post in that we just wrote about how important this is for us to encourage and support a holistic approach to our grant making that considers all aspects of your partners, your grantees' humanity, which includes everything from retreats to paid time off to what kind of spiritual or emotional support systems they have. You don't have to be the one to prescribe or have the answer, but very important that we prioritize that. So like Melina said, time to move away from ourselves being thinking about short-term project funding. That's what I did for a long time. It was project by project, and that was sexy and exciting, and it was fun, but it was not long-term thinking that was really going to sustain us. So next slide, we need to just start thinking like a marathon, not like a sprint towards the burnout line. Next slide. So really moving the money where the trauma is the deepest. And sorry, there's a lot of words on this slide, but we're just trying to say basically that some ways you could do it is adding in it as a percentage of your budget. Say 5% of the budget you write of your grant could actually be going towards healing justice work. And if groups don't even know what that looks like, it's probably because no one's asked them. And for us to actually ask them, that might make them start thinking, hey, we really need this in our work. Thank you for asking us this question. And like we had talked about earlier, just really recognizing and honoring and funding traditional systems of care that might require extra things like medicines, elders, support. So Melina talked about how we're doing that at Indigenous Climate Action too. Next slide. And so this really requires us to invest the time, money, effort, resources into relationship building. So take the time to do that and actually show up at the front lines. I did a talk in New Zealand called Frontline Philanthropy. Like, do you gotta feel it to know it? and try to understand at some level what the realities are like for the communities that you serve, even if it means leaving the office and computer screen more, or if it means being in difficult situations. Next slide. And you don't have to know all the answers about how to do everything. There's places like the Wincall Institute that already do this. They provide retreat spaces. There's already trauma training institutes. And for example, with our recent delegation of our staff that went to the COP conference, we needed to also resource them with before, after, during tools that we didn't know where to find funding for. And a great funder came in and actually gave honorariums to each staff to do health and wellness and for themselves and what they needed, which was really beautiful. Next slide. But that really means that we're going to have to fund outside of the box, and it really means we're going to have to get less attached to our outcomes. And it might mean, because it's hard to report on intangibles, and it might mean that you need to hire a full-time healing justice coordinator. I'm seeing a lot of that happening now, which is exciting. And maybe it means you have to fund things that are out of your realms of, you know, we only fund environmental, but maybe we need to fund things like ritual, spirituality, medicines, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide, please. And so there's these great examples. We don't have a lot of time to go into them, but Melina's going to put in the chat there just a link to the Astria Foundation, and there's great resources on this on their site about this beautiful report that they did with Wellspring Philanthropic Fund, and they did case studies on Urgent Action Fund and Groundswell, who are also doing wonderful things, such as Groundswell created a wellness fund, a rapid response fund, and a reproductive justice fund. And we're absolutely overwhelmed with their response of the need out there, just because they had put it out to ask. So this last quote, I just want to say before we move to Melina's closing section, is this beautiful quote by Shalini. And she's really talking about the context of this quote was after they had sent all their grantees to retreats and to trainings and to healings and for resting. Then they came back and actually asked them what had changed. And they said that although their environment hadn't changed, the fight was still the same. They actually, what changed was that their ability was to respond from a healed place in a way that they know that they can sustain that for their lifetimes. And that they know now how to engage with trauma and the trauma of their situations and others' trauma in a very authentic way that ensured their to this work. Really the best outcome we can hope for. So I'm going to pass it back to Melina to close us out. Thank you.
Thank you, Pearl. So just really quickly, before I go into the closing embodiment section, just wanted to share quickly around the healing justice work that ICA specifically is doing, and where we've had to fundraise for exactly what Pearl has been talking about, of fundraising for healing justice staff, including myself and Pearl, to build out our healing justice team, to take trainings and connect and work with experts in this field, so we're not working in silos, to do youth wellness grants, to do COP26 care and support and debriefs, which I think myself and Pearl included didn't ever get support and debrief after attending multiple COPs. Creating trauma-informed tools for staff that eventually can again go out to the larger movement, compiling resources that exist so far, doing outreach and education and presentations like this to inform the field of philanthropy as well as other larger movement spaces, building and connecting to find spaces and places of healing, because there is not a lot of actual physicalized places of healing for Indigenous land defenders to come and gather together, because a lot of times when we are in our homelands, we are literally defending them from encroachment, incorporation. So a lot of times we can't even sometimes be in places of healing in our own communities because there is crisis happening. So sometimes we have to go to collective spaces, and you'd be surprised how little spaces of that do exist, unfortunately. And so that's something we're looking at creating more of and working with allies and partners on that. So all of that to close out, I know we've thrown a lot of information at you. But we really wanted to share this with you all because we think it's a really important dialogue that we need to have more and more with funders as well as within our movement spaces as a whole. But to close, I'm going to ask you now to just kind of sit back. You can either put your video on or take your video off, and we're no longer going to stay in the head and stay in the cognitive. You can kind of shake it out, shake out your day. Let out some deep breaths. Just kind of shake it out. You don't have to think. You don't have to concentrate as hard. This is a place for you just to kind of integrate the rest of the beauty that is healing justice. And so for me, what I learned, I really want to share this, and I love sharing this box. It's called a box breathing technique, and it really changed my life and my ability to deal with pain and to deal with trauma and to bring what we talked about of the being in a sympathetic into a parasympathetic nervous system to kind of self-regulate and to also co-regulate. So a box breathing technique is actually a lot of frontline, even like firefighters and stuff use this. So it's kind of like the neuroscience that's out there is utilizing these techniques as well. So I'm just going to ask you to sit in your chair, close your eyes if you can. And it's the reason why it's called box is because it's a 4-4-4. And so it's a breathe in 4, a hold for 4, a release for 4, and you do it 4 times. And because we are on limited time, I'm going to do it at least 2 times with you all. And you can do this all for yourself, anytime you want, in the elevator, at home, anytime you need to kind of self-regulate and bring yourself back into a relaxed state. So just breathe a couple of regular breaths in and out. Again, in and out. And I'm just going to count you in. So I'm going to ask you to breathe to count to 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4 on your in-breath. Hold now. Counting 1, 2, 3, 4. And release. 1, 2, 3, 4. Again. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. And you hold it in. 1, 2, 3, 4. And release. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll let you do that on your own one more time. Breathe in. Just count yourself. Hold. And release. So this is homework for everybody. You can do this 4 times. So try to do it yourself 4 times. Just 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. It's really easy to remember. And now I'm going to ask everyone, you can keep your eyes closed. You don't have to open them. To put your hand on your heart. Bring your body into this. We've been in the brain. We're in the cognition in this society, in the places and spaces we live, unfortunately, too much. So bring yourself into your body. If you can, put your hand on your heart. Feel your heart. Feel your body. Feel your toes. Feel your legs. Just, one word. What is one thing, just in your own heart, of how you feel today? One word of gratitude of what you learned today, what connection you might have made today, what you heard that was challenging or unchallenging, or anything that you can potentially extend gratitude for. I think when we feel overwhelmed, we go into this crisis mode and everything piles up. And I'm really challenging myself as well to be in gratitude, because things feel a lot more manageable when you can just think of one thing that you're grateful for, whether it be the water, the air. And then I'm just going to close now, bringing our spirit into this. I'm going to close with a quick prayer in my language. Hai kichimanitu nakokom namusum kihiu mahiguan maskwa. Thank you, ancestors, creator, creation, for all that you give us, all that you bring us. Thank you for the water that we've drank today, the air that we've breathed, the connections we've made, the love that we've felt, the challenges that we feel that we're able to address from a kind and gentle place. Thank you for this connection here with one another as we try to make the world around us better than when we first arrived here on Mother Earth. Thank you for IFIP, for bringing people together that care so much about the earth that we live on and our communities, and that we're a part of, the organizations that we're a part of as well. And thank you for all the people here today. Just so much gratitude. Despite the challenge, despite the adversity, all of the gratitude, all of the goodness that comes into our life because of this work as well. I just thank you. Hai Kichimanitu. Thank you all so much for joining us today in this work. One question that we're just going to leave you with, either personally or collectively, is how do we create the conditions for healing justice to occur? That's what I'll leave you with today, and I thank you so much for listening to us and being with us in spirit and in heart and minds, all of us. Hi. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Pal and Melina for that very powerful session that we've just had. And I just want to take this moment to also just be grateful to you for your time, for your knowledge, for giving of your time, your knowledge, your experiences in this space from yesterday. And even as we go towards the last day tomorrow, sorry, the time difference always gets me. As we move towards the last day, I hope that we can reflect on what we've been discussing in the past 2 days and move towards action on the third day, and also think about what Marlene and Pala have just shared with us about healing justice for ourselves, and taking time to just pause and think about our own healing, about our own well-being, and seeing how we can bring that into our own organizations and into our places of work. And so just as we think about that, as we move toward the third day, I want to say thank you. I want to wish you a good day or a good afternoon, whatever your time, for a good evening, depending on where you are. And I look forward to seeing all your faces again tomorrow, and continuing our connection even beyond the retreat. So thank you so much, and have a good time, and I hope to see you tomorrow. And I hope you're energized towards the end. So thank you, and have a good afternoon. Bye.
Should we pause the recording?